This is just absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible. Look at it. The rock wags all over the place. Maybe I need to put some bigger rocks in around it or something. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it. I'm fed up with that one. Absolutely fed up. I'm going to leave it. In this activity, I challenged myself to make a terrarium. Unfortunately, I couldn't limit myself to just one and ended up making more than 10 different miniature gardens. While I loved this project, there were lots of fiddly obstacles to overcome, like finding suitable containers, getting the soil mix right, creating a balance between the hardscape components and the plants, and finding lids for all the containers that didn't come with cork stoppers. Plus, I stuffed up on some of my early creations, so it was probably a good thing that I had a few different sizes and types of jars to practice on. Terrariums seem to be very much in fashion at the moment, with florists and garden centre shops selling beautiful ready-made glass containers with luxurious little plants. Kits for making your own terrarium are popular too, especially as a gift item or to put together as part of a hobby class. But it's actually much harder to build a terrarium from scratch because of all the different components that have to be brought together, most of which come in large packets when you only need a handful or less of each if you're only making one terrarium. When I was a child, we lived in a house on a standard quarter-acre block, so there was plenty of space for a big garden. Both my parents loved gardening, and over the years it grew to be a very special place. I clearly inherited this love of nurturing plants, and everywhere I've lived, I've at least had a flower bed and a big vegetable garden. Over the last 10 years, I've developed a special interest in both bonsai and succulents. Although my bonsai collection is small, there are some lovely little trees in it, including an oak that is over 20 years old and a variety of different pine species. My interest in succulents started about 8 years ago, and my collection rapidly grew to the point where I really had to stop, but I've never tried my hand at making terrariums, so I was especially excited by this project. The 5 major components of a terrarium are the container in which the terrarium is built, the substrate in which the plants will grow, some decorative landscaping components called the hardscape, the plants themselves, and some sort of topper to cover any exposed soil. Plus some specialist tools are needed, especially if the opening to the container is narrow or the container is very tall. Terrarium containers are traditionally glass. Although perspex and plastic containers could be used, they are less pleasing aesthetically and are harder to keep clean, especially plastics. I could have purchased a few glass terrarium bowls from a garden centre, but they proved to be extremely expensive, so I spent a few hours hunting through charity shops where the second-hand glass bowls and jars are quite cheap. Plus I also purchased 2 containers from IKEA, 2 from Target and 1 from a dollar store. I then spent some time removing labels and giving them all a thorough wash so that they were ready to receive their beautiful little gardens. Only a few of the containers had stoppers, and I spent a lot of time trying to find some for the others. Getting some cork bungs was the obvious answer, but it turned out that there were none available in Australia in the various sizes that I needed, and purchasing and shipping individual cork stoppers from a store in the UK proved to be prohibitively expensive. I also looked at using perspex discs, but this turned out to be very expensive too. Finally, I used my new 3D printing skills to make some of my own, though in the meanwhile I covered the tops with plastic wrap to keep the moisture in. Water is a mixed blessing for plants. Too little and they will die sooner or later. Too much and they'll also die. Some plants can survive with wet roots, but most cannot because their roots eventually rot. It is therefore essential to start with a drainage layer. Any coarse substrate can be used, such as small rocks, gravel, pumice or lava rocks. I used hydroclay pebbles, which are made for the base of aquariums. After that comes a filter layer of either moss or insect screen mesh, which is what I used. Fortunately, I had a roll of the plastic mesh and so was able to easily cut some small circular pieces, the right size for each of the different glass containers. A layer of activated charcoal is then spread over the filter to help keep the terrarium clean, as it acts as a natural antimicrobial agent. However, I struck a problem with this because it turned out that the charcoal that I had purchased was much too coarse to use. So, in a very messy process, I put a few handfuls in a thick plastic bag, which I placed between 2 layers of cardboard and crushed with a hammer. I then spread the larger chunks across the mesh and included the smaller pieces in with the soil mix. A soil layer is then spread on top of the charcoal, with the soil made up of a mix of a selection of various possible mediums, such as chopped sphagnum moss, cocoa fibre, orchid bark, charcoal, worm castings, or peat moss. Because I couldn't find a commercial terrarium soil mix locally, I used a commercial succulent soil mix, to which I added the fine charcoal, some finely chopped peat moss, and a few handfuls of chopped sphagnum moss, which I mixed up in a small tub. Hardscape means the pieces of interesting wood, sticks, pebbles and rocks that are included to make the terrarium look more like a proper landscape. I gathered my hardscape pieces from a variety of places along a beach on the south coast, where I picked up some weathered wood, some rock that had fallen from the roof of a cave, a small bucket of sand and some dried out seaweed. And from the bush near where I live, I gathered some lichen-covered branches and other interesting rocks. I had a lot of trouble stopping myself from buying plants. Because terrariums have become so popular lately, all of my local garden nurseries stock a wonderful range of ferns, fittonia and succulents and other plants suitable for terrariums. After a week of happy visits to garden centres, I had over 25 to choose from. In addition, I raided my own succulent collection for cuttings and baby plants. Finally, after all of the plants and hardscape pieces are in place, some sort of cover for the soil is put down, usually either moss or fine rocks. While this is mostly for decorative purposes, it does help keep the soil moist. For rock toppers, I also purchased a variety of commercial packs of different colours and sizes in white, gold and black. I introduced the rock toppers into the finished terrariums with a funnel that I made out of a roll of paper. For the moss covering, I purchased a pack from a terrarium specialty shop in Melbourne, plus I took some pieces of moss from one of several big platters of moss that I grow to use on my bonsai pots. The last thing I needed to be able to make my terrariums was some specific tools which I purchased online from a terrarium specialty shop in Melbourne, Flower and Twig, a telescopic spoon and rake, and some long-handled tweezers. I also bought 3 long-handled paintbrushes from an art supply shop, and I made an improvised tampering tool from a bamboo skewer and a wine bottle cork. To start my terrarium building experience, I selected 2 large glass containers so that I'd have enough space inside to work with relatively easily. I'd seen people making terrariums in either very small containers or narrow-necked containers, and it looked quite challenging. I then decided to make one a dry xeriscape environment with succulents and the other a wet environment based on ferns and various fittonia. I poured a layer of hydroclay pebbles into each container and then covered them with the wire mesh filter. To that I added the crushed charcoal and some soil mix, then spent some time deciding on the hardscape components for each one. I loved making the xeriscape terrarium and was really happy with how it came together. To me, the piece of broken branch looked just like a log, and the white granite topper helped create a desert scene, into which I'd placed a variety of succulents from my own collection. The fishbowl shape made it easy to see the plants, even from a distance. Because this container hadn't come with a lid, after a generous watering, I covered it with clear plastic wrap. However, while I was happy with the composition of my second attempt, frustratingly, I had put too much substrate and soil in the bottom, which meant that the plants were too high up, and when the lid was put on, the whole lovely little garden scene was hard to see. I had tried to slope the soil upwards to the back so that the big rock would stand out, but with the weight of all the gold-brown topper that I had put on the surface, the soil on the high side had subsided to the lower area, and the garden came out flat and a bit crowded. However, I consoled myself with the thought that I'd leave it on my office desk and take the lid off and peer into it whenever I needed a little zen moment. Having made a mistake with the second terrarium, I decided to make a third one straight away, using the tallest container that I had. Again, I probably put in too much soil, but I liked the fact that I could see the hydroclay pebbles at the bottom and the layer of charcoal above that, and I liked the tall stick that looked like a section of broken tree stump in the forest. I used 3 different types of Photonia, plus the tall peperomia plant. Then I took some pieces of moss from the big platter and put them around the bottom. At the end of the day, I was quite satisfied with my 3 little garden creations, but when I looked at the remaining glass containers, I felt somewhat intimidated, especially by the tall, narrow one. Well, that one is a complete mess, absolute, complete, awful mess. It just has got all the ferns have got dirt in their leaves. The rock sunk right in, you can hardly see the rock. On the second day of construction, I built 7 more terrariums, and from each one I learnt a lesson, the first one of which was to not get any soil on any of the plants, especially the lacy ferns, because it was almost impossible to get it off without pulling the plant out of the container again and washing it in a bucket of water. I also learnt that it was hard to get a big plant back out of a narrow-necked container, and that I had to allow room for the cork stopper when placing a tall plant in a tall container. I also learnt that I hadn't chopped the dried sphagnum moss fine enough, and its long forked strands got in the way of placing the plants, so I ended up pulling a lot of it out again. All up, however, I had a fabulous time. And a month later, I'm still very happy with my 14 little gardens, which sit in a thriving avenue down my hallway. While I saved some money buying glass containers from charity shops and discount variety stores, I did end up spending a lot of money on the plants, the various soil components, and the toppers. The total for the glass containers came to $55.85. The soil components totaled $40.75. The toppers totaled $36.84. The plants total came to $137.98. The tools and the moss that I didn't use, plus postage from Flower and Twig in Melbourne, came to $73.95, and I bought a water spray bottle for $3.98 and a set of 3 paintbrushes for $9.95. With a grand total of $359.30, the average price for each terrarium was about $26, which is about half the cost of the ready-made terrariums that are currently for sale in garden centres. Join me for my next episode when I go camping on my BMW F750 motorcycle to one of Australia's most beautiful coastal estuaries in the southern state of Victoria. For more information about living your own unlived life, if you go to my website, you can download a copy of my free book, Living Your Unlived Life, Finding Contentment by Honouring Your Dreams. And if it's your thing, you could like this video and subscribe to my channel.